Hey everyone, and welcome back to Build UX. In this series, we review popular websites for best practices, with a strong focus on accessibility. We find small changes we can make that'll have a big impact on improving the user experience for everyone. In this episode, we're reviewing the Neuralink website. Neuralink is focused on creating implant devices that create a human-computer interface, and has the potential to really help people with disabilities by allowing them to better interface with technology. So, with a major target audience of users with disabilities, let's see how we can improve this website's accessibility. I'm really drawn to the visual design of the site, and our changes will really improve the user experience for everyone without compromising on looks. What we're going to do is start off with manual review, and that'll basically be doing a visual review, so assessing things that we're looking at here for accessibility, and then we'll move on to keyboard navigation testing, some screen reader testing, and then we'll dive into the actual underlying code of this and look for small improvements that we can make to the code base. After that, we'll cover some automated testing options that you have for accessibility in particular and some other best practices, but I'll explain why I don't really place an emphasis on those and I don't use that as the start of my review for any website. So to kick things off, let's do a visual review of this website. And this will mainly involve looking at things as we click around. And particularly, I'm going to be looking at things like contrast, legibility. We'll do a zoom test, and then we'll start moving through some more navigation and screen reader testing. So taking a look here, I noticed that although the visual design of this website is very pleasing, there are a lot of contrast issues that I haven't tested, but I'm pretty sure are going to be problematic. So the first thing is that we have this white text on pretty faint pastel backgrounds. And although they look nice with these dedicated illustrations, I think that we will find that everything is lacking contrast. In fact, I think even this gray in the footer for the text is probably not sufficient in terms of contrast. So inspecting this particular element, it looks like our text is pure white. And then the background of just this first section here is this faint blue, kind of gray blue color. So we have an RGB of 180, 189, and 203. And I like to use this website called Colorable from John Black to test my contrast because it's focused on hue, saturation, lightness, or HSL. That's a really handy way to basically test for contrast and see how we can adjust the colors to have more of a passing contrast ratio. So converting those RGB values, the text is pure white, so that's FFF repeated. And the background color was B4BD CB. And you can see that the contrast ratio is very low, especially in this top section. We only have 1.89 for the contrast ratio. We need at least 4.5 to 1 contrast ratio to pass for accessibility guidelines. So since the text is pure white, all we really have as an option is to darken the background. So I'm going to drag this lightness value down. And you can see the contrast ratio is increasing. And again, we want to get at least to 4.5. So this would be the bare minimum passing threshold here with this hex value of 657792. So let's go over to our rules panel and let's scroll down and see where this background color is coming from. Here it is here. So if we swap that out, you'll see that it is a design change, but it doesn't really compromise on the visual aesthetics of the website. And now we have sufficient contrast. So we'd want to make this improvement to these other sections as well. You would basically just repeat this pattern. So I'm going to refresh here to get back to our kind of baseline, and let's keep doing a visual review here. So as I noted, there are contrast issues throughout that we could easily tweak with some quick design changes. Next up, I'm thinking about the legibility. So we have very legible typefaces, and overall, I understand the affordances of interactive elements on here. I can presume that these are links, same with this sidebar or top navigation on the top right. Everything is pretty clearly laid out here. If we dive into a detail page, we have some really nice illustrations. The visual styling of this website is great. And I have here what I presume to be an accordion pattern. And so we'll want to test that with the keyboard in just a second to make sure that that's fully accessible. One thing I am noticing in their footer here is they have this subscription input with extremely faint placeholder text and no dedicated label. So if I had low vision, I would not be able to understand what this control is for. And so my recommendation here is to increase the contrast of this placeholder text, but placeholder text is problematic because as soon as you start typing, it goes away. So if you have trouble remembering things in the short term, you wouldn't know what this input is really for. So my recommendation is just to add a dedicated label here and make the needed contrast updates. I really don't think that would compromise on the looks of this footer. And you can see more bright colors that are pretty faint. So contrast across the board is definitely lacking, especially with the headings for this accordion. One last thing we can do as a quick visual check is called the zoom test. And if I have low vision, it's often helpful for me to scale up the interface to make the typography more legible. So I'm just hitting Control and plus, and it's common to test this up to 300 or 500%. Basically see if you're able to zoom the interface appropriately. And if you're following responsive web design best practices, typically what you're basically doing is kind of forcing a mobile view, just a quite scaled up version of it. And this way, if I had low vision, hopefully this text is large enough that I can read it. So this passes the zoom test. From what I can tell, everything is scaling pretty intuitively. One thing I'm noticing, it seems to be on mobile, they are getting rid of their footer content. So not sure how I feel about that from a usability perspective. But it looks like overall their typography and layout are responding to zooming just fine. Next thing I would do is getting into more testing. So the first pass of this is keyboard navigation. So for users with mobility issues or repetitive strain injuries, it's common to rely on the keyboard over the mouse to navigate websites and web apps. And this is primarily done with the Tab and Shift Tab keys. So I'm going to click on the very top left of this page, or if I refresh, that would basically set focus to the very top of this document. Now from here, I'm going to start hitting Tab, and what I'm keeping an eye on is if I can tell where keyboard focus is progressing throughout the interface. So I'm going to hit Tab, and it looks like I'm getting a browser default focus ring, which is a 1-pixel dotted outline in some versions of Firefox. Safari and Chromium-based browsers are updating their default focus rings to be a little bit more legible, but it's best to always provide a custom focus ring whenever possible. So I'm on the logo up in the top here. And if I progress, it looks like it's inheriting the text color in this top navigation. So it's even more difficult to discern where keyboard focus is. And if I go further, yeah, it looks like this site is relying on all of the default browser styles. So it's extremely faint and hard to see in a lot of places. For instance, keyboard focus is currently on one of these 3 detail pages that are called out on the homepage here, but it's extremely hard to see. And if we continue on, basically the same story all the way throughout. You can see in the footer here that they do a slight color change on focus, which I'm guessing they matched over on their hover state. So if you hover with the mouse, you can see that they basically just copied that over. This isn't the worst thing, but you can't rely on a color change alone because there's no dedicated indicator of keyboard focus. And lastly, I want to see what happens with this form input here. Okay, so yeah, color change as well. I did notice that on these detail pages, they often have an accordion at the bottom, and it works as expected with the mouse, but let's see if it is built with the keyboard in mind. Anytime you have custom interaction patterns, it's likely that if you don't build it with accessibility in mind, that many users cannot actually interact with this component. So I'm hitting Tab, and it looks like focus just moved right past it. Here I'm on the link before this diagram. If I hit Tab once more, I think focus is somewhere in this component, but I actually can't tell. And if I look on the bottom left, it looks to be focused on this element down here, actually. I saw that the URL of approach was what had keyboard focus. So there's basically no way for keyboard users to interact with this accordion. So this important learn more content might as well not even be here for a lot of users. And that's a big issue that we'll want to resolve. The next kind of layer of testing, which is kind of an umbrella around keyboard navigation testing, is to test with the screen reader. On Windows, there's NVDA, which is an open source tool that I like to use for screen reader testing. And on Mac, VoiceOver is built into the operating system. So let's start up NVDA and do a quick walkthrough. You'll hear the audio being announced. And a good exercise for this is to close your eyes or look away from your monitor and see if you can actually understand the structure of the content and make your way through the website as expected, only using the keyboard and the audio cues. Not all screen reader users have low or no vision, but it is kind of a good way to test, assuming that you're dependent fully on the audio cues from the screen reader. So I'm going to boot up NVDA here. And the most important control in both NVDA and VoiceOver is to use the control key to pause reading at any moment. Sometimes when you're moving around the interface, it can be announcing quite a bit of information. Sometimes it'll re-announce things you've already heard. And it can be overwhelming as a new user of a screen reader. So using a control key to pause what's being announced is really handy. And as you become more of a power user, there's a lot of information that you already know or can predict based on the types of controls you're in. Sometimes it reads out long descriptions that you don't really need to hear if you're already planning on moving ahead. So hitting control to pause things is really handy.
Home Neuralink Mozilla Firefox. Home Neuralink document. Main landmark breakthrough technology for the brain heading level 1. Join the team link.
So I hit control there because it just started reading out quite a bit of content. A lot of it is top level page information that's helpful to know. But in my case, I'm just interested in moving through the interface. Now with NVDA, I can use the up or down arrow keys to kind of move node by node. And we'll also explore the elements list, which will allow us to jump to major regions of the document. On VoiceOver, it's similar where you can use control option in the arrows to move around. And then there's a feature called rotor mode that is kind of analogous to the elements list. First off, let's move node by node to start moving through this document.
Heading level 1 technology. Heading level 1 for the brain. Link join the team. Link watch the update.
So right now we are on the links in this hero section. Let's continue moving through.
Link heading level 2 understanding. Link heading level 2 the brain fig 1. Link science.
Okay, so the 3 links at the bottom of the homepage here, they jammed all of the text content into a link. So we have understanding the brain, figure 1, and science as being announced all as the same link. So we'll want to evaluate the user experience of that content and if all of that should be the link or have briefer text for the actual link.
Link heading level 2 interfacing. Link heading, link approach. Link heading level 2, link heading level 2, link applications.
Okay, so that gives you a sense of how you can evaluate heading levels and the text content within different nodes. Let's open up the elements list and see how we might traverse this document. So on NVDA, this is done with insert and F7.
Elements list dialog. Tree view. Level 0 engineering with.
So I hit control to pause reading. You can navigate the document in several ways with the elements list. We have by type of links, headings, form fields, buttons, and landmarks. And in rotor mode, in VoiceOver, it's very similar. So if we hit Shift Tab to go up to the radio options.
Type, grouping, links radio button checked Alt plus K.
We can either use the shortcut keys, in this case K, H, F, B, and D to navigate these, or use the right and left arrow keys to navigate this radio group. So I'm interested in landmarks, for example. Let's hit D.
D. Landmarks radio button checked Alt. Tree view. Main 2 of 3 levels.
And then I'm going to move focus into this tree view of the actual landmarks. So tree views, you can use the arrow keys to navigate.
Level 1 header, level 0 banner collapsed. Content collapsed.
So I'm going to collapse everything down, and you can tell there's 3 overall landmarks on the page. We have banner, which is basically the header tag in HTML5, the main section, which is main, content info, which correlates to footer, and within those, we might have some additional landmarks. All right, so to expand this open, let's use the right arrow key.
Filter by, edit alt, tree view, expanded, 1 items.
All right, so we have 1 item within the banner.
Level 1 header navigation, navigation 1 of 1.
All right, so you can hear a little bit of redundant information. Now, the developers did something nice here, which is specify that this navigation is the header navigation, but they included navigation as a word in terms of the label for this landmark. So it's really redundant because the navigation role is already announced by the screen reader. So we'll look at that when we get into the code, but it's important to evaluate with screen readers to also find if developers are doing a little bit too much to provide labels for screen readers. In this case, it's redundant information.
Levels, content info collapsed, expanded, level 1 footer navigation, navigation 1 of 1.
And you can hear that there's the same issue with the footer navigation. They could just leave it as footer and navigation as a role is already announced. It's important also to navigate things by headings. That's also a very common way of moving through a document. So let's go back up to our type selector here.
Type, grouping.
And I'm going to hit H to jump
Headings
over.
radio button checked Alt plus H.
And we'll see an interesting structure in here if we tab in.
Tree view, level 0 Neuralink 1 of 2. Breakthrough technology for the brain expanded 2 of 2 level 0. Level 1 understanding the brain fig 1 1 of 4. Interfacing with the brain fig 2 2 of 4 level 1.
So you can hear that there are some interesting heading levels going on here. We seem to have 2 that are top level, which is already a red flag. And then within that, we have some level 2 headings, which seems to be fine. But we definitely want to address that unusual structure where we have 2, what it calls level 0 headings, which in HTML is actually H1. I'm going to close the elements list for now and turn off NVDA. But this is just a quick example of how we might navigate through a document and kind of understand the semantic structure without having to look into the code yet.
Exit NVDA. Restart. Exit. OK button.
All right, so with NVDA closed, let's continue our review. The next stage that I would go through is to grab the actual source code of the page and paste it into a text editor. That way we can review the underlying code. And we'll basically see that a lot of the screen reader or keyboard navigation issues that we spotted all come down to the HTML markup, basically. So I would go ahead and copy the source and paste it into a text editor, and we'll go from there. So what I've done is taken the index page as well as one of the detail pages, in this case, it's the science page, and copied their source code into VS Code here. Now with this, I've already formatted it to clean it up. And one thing I really like in VS Code is the code folding option. That way we can focus on just the areas of interest. So the head isn't really relevant for our review here. I'm going to collapse this down. And within the body, let's just start folding things up so we can see what the major landmarks or structure of our code are. So we have our header, main, and footer. And you'll see that this is what really drove the landmarks menu, where we heard banner, the main section, and the footer with a row of content info. And you can see the developers here actually specified ARIA roles for these landmarks. This is one of the first changes that we'll actually make is with HTML5, these are already implied by using semantic tags. So this is really redundant and not needed. The only reason to include these roles is if you're dealing with a very old browser support target. But in the case of HTML5, it's pretty likely that there's great support for these semantic elements. So this is really redundant. I like to avoid adding these manually unless they're absolutely necessary, because it introduces opportunities to make mistakes and communicate a role that's not actually intended, or to have a typo. And sometimes that can interfere with the actual native semantics of a landmark. So my first change would be to get rid of these redundant role attributes. And if we were to do that and you were to navigate in the elements list, the landmarks would still communicate the same information in the screen reader. So that'd be the first change. Let's start going through and taking a look at some of the finer details. So let's start with the header. Right, within the header, we find our first issue that we noticed with the headings, which is that there were two H1 headings. And you can see if we do a search for H1, we have the breakthrough technology heading, as well as the home link in our top navigation. Now the home link in the case of the index page does represent the H1, whereas the breakthrough technology for the brain is probably more of an H2 content. And this would be specific to just the home page. So I might actually leave this as an H1. My preferred pattern for this, however, is to retain this visually hidden text, to label this link. And then what I would probably do if we move into our main content is to add an H1 with the text of Neuralink, because this represents the unique content for this particular page. In the case of the home page, the home link and the H1 are kind of the same purpose, but what we want to do is often the header would be a component that's shared across all pages. So we wouldn't want to bake an H1 into that because it doesn't represent the main idea of all the other pages. So with this, it looks like their convention is to use an underscore hidden class. And let's take a look at that in the DevTools real quick. So I'm going to inspect the logo here. And this hidden class, if I increase the size of my DevTools here, is basically a utility for visually hiding text, but still making it available for assistive technology. This is using a really extreme absolute left position with negative 10,000 pixels. This is a really common approach for visually hidden text. Another approach is to use a combination of clip path and width and height. So this is one viable approach. I typically stick with clip path, but this seems to be doing its function just fine. So that'd be the first change I would make, is to move the H1 into the actual body and clean up our H1 in the global navigation. The next thing would be to change this breakthrough technology for the brain text into an H2. That would be a better structural match for these remaining articles that all lead to different detail pages. So it's important to separate the document and content structure from the visual presentation of things. It's really common, for example, to have an H2 that actually has a larger text size visually than the H1, or in this case, to not show the H1 at all. In the same vein, a lot of times you'll actually find that your paragraph text might be quite large, but your heading is just a small eyebrow text. And that's fine as long as we have a good separation between the heading structure and the actual presentation. Some other things I'm noticing in the code is we have SVG elements for our icons. So we have the right arrow icons in our call to actions that you can see here. One thing I like to do just as a precaution is to manually add ARIA hidden is equal to true. And this is because these are decorative elements and we don't want screen readers to focus on these elements and announce their information because they don't contain any actual content. The exception to this is if you add a complex SVG for an illustration, let's say maybe something like the illustration that we find on this science page. If this was an SVG, you might actually want to include text within the SVG that you want assistive technology to be able to focus on and announce to users. So in that case, you might take the approach of something like the title element within an SVG, and that would explain something like the anatomy of a brain neuron, for example, something along those lines. And in that case, you wouldn't want to make it hidden to assistive technology. But in our case, if it's just a decorative icon, for example, it's a safeguard to add ARIA hidden true. So I would go ahead and add that to any SVGs that are purely decorative, which is usually the case anytime you're using icons. So that's another change that I would recommend. Let's keep scrolling here and see what other changes we can make. I'm seeing something interesting here where we have an A tag that links to a YouTube video and it says watch the update. So that seems to make sense in terms of the actual text content, but they have a title attribute that says see job listings for Neuralink. And this is a great example of somebody attempting to provide an accessible name, but introducing some risk to this approach because there's actually a mismatch between the functionality and the actual content of this link versus what they're trying to communicate to assistive technology. There's kind of two mistakes in one here. The first part is that the title attribute is not sufficient for all screen readers and forms of assistive technology to provide an accessible name. My preferred approach, if you needed something that was actually hidden visually, would be to use the helper class that they already had. So you could do hidden, and I would make that a span. And I would put this text inside of a hidden tag. You can tell that this isn't needed because we have visual text that better describes the actual function of this. Now, what title attributes mainly do, if we go back to that home page, is provide a sort of native tooltip if you hover over the content for a while. But these don't show by default with using keyboards, so they really don't help in terms of accessibility like some people think they do. So this title is detrimental because some screen readers might announce it, and they might announce it in lieu of the actual link text. And you can see this is basically a mistake. It's not the actual function or content of this link. So my recommendation would be to remove this. And if you did need to provide an accessible name that wasn't shown, go with visually hidden text instead. Continuing on here, another thing I didn't touch on just yet that I noticed is there is this section tag here. Now, section is basically a generic HTML5 element. It has no native semantics to it. And section can be handy for dividing up your content into nice, neat areas. So you can see that that's essentially how they're using it here. It looks like their overall use of this section tag is fine. But one thing is without a dedicated name for this landmark, it doesn't mean anything for assistive technology. So my recommended approach, anytime you're using a section, is to add an ARIA label. And in this case, ARIA label would point to the ID of some text that you have that gives an actual name to the section. So what I would probably say is breakthrough heading. And I would take this and add it as an ID to this heading text here. And that way, in the landmarks section of the elements list or rotor mode, you would see that there is a landmark that talks about the breakthrough technology for the brain. So that actually would give a name to this section instead. So my other recommendation for these would be to add dedicated ARIA labels to these sections to give them more distinct semantic structure. While we're here, it's important to touch on the navigation information that was announced when we used the elements list. So I forgot to look at that when we were going through the header. So let's try and find that element. And while we're looking at that, I'm noticing something really interesting where we have an SVG with an ARIA label of open navigation. I'm guessing this is shown on mobile devices. So let's see if we can get this to appear. So I'm going to go into inspector mode, open up responsive design mode, and pick a small breakpoint. And I'm guessing this is our SVG here. It is, and I'm assuming that they're attaching a click event somehow to this SVG. It must be done through JavaScript. I don't see anything as a hook for JS right out the box, but they seem to be watching this with JavaScript somehow. So this is problematic for a few reasons. And the first one is that you can't assume that mobile users are not relying on assistive technology. And so it's important to always use semantic HTML and make sure that everything can still use keyboard navigation and assistive technology regardless of device width. Now that people have 4K monitors, ultra wides, it's really common to actually make the browser width pretty narrow so you can fit 2, 3, 4 panels on your screen at once. And so with that, regardless of disability, regardless of your mode of interacting, it's much more common to actually see near mobile views or less than full 1080p width desktop experiences, even if you're using a desktop computer. So for those reasons and many others, I like to make sure that all breakpoints of a website are fully keyboard navigation possible, that they support assistive technology. I don't want to make assumptions about viewport width and try to predict what device or mode of interaction people are using. So instead of an SVG here with an ARIA label, this really should be a button. And buttons, it's important to always assign a type attribute to them. So that way it prevents any type of form submission. I'm going to remove this ARIA label, but we want to keep that text there. And what I would do instead is say ARIA hidden true. And within this, we can use their same helper class of hidden and paste the text inside of there. And with some CSS, this could visually appear to be identical to the menu that they have, but we would want to add a custom focus style, and it would enable users to use the keyboard to actually interact with this menu. Now, there would be a lot more to it. For example, if we were to open this menu with a keyboard, we would want focus to move into these items. And since this mobile menu overlays on top of the entire website, we'd want to make sure that focus cycles or is trapped within this until we are able to close the menu. We would return focus back to this open button. So this is very much a bare bones example of what that might look like, but these are some of the initial things I'm noticing. That would be a definitely more intensive project, but definitely feasible, and it shouldn't impact visual styling except for adding focus rings and helpful details. Now back on track, we have our other landmark elements that are the nav elements here. You can see that there's an ARIA labeled by attribute. And now that I think about it, let's make sure, yeah, I misspoke earlier. This should actually be ARIA labeled by for these section elements. And that way it can point to an ID. ARIA label would just announce whatever is inside of here. So that's my mistake. I misspoke and mistyped that. But back to our navigation elements, we have ARIA labeled by. And this is a good approach. This matches what we'd expect to see, but this was where we found that redundant information. So my recommendation here is to simply remove navigation from this ARIA labeled by, and that way it'll just say header navigation instead of header navigation navigation. So less redundant. Similar to that, we had the nav in the footer. And sorry if I'm jumping around a little bit, but it's important to tackle landmark work kind of holistically when you're going through. And we'll see a similar issue here. We have footer navigation, so I'd remove the word navigation from that label or the accessible name. Now, in both the top navigation and the footer navigation is one area where we actually do need a role, and that is with list elements. So with OL and UL elements, or the ordered and unordered lists, by default, they have an implicit role of role list in terms of assistive technology. However, a common thing, I'm just going to write an inline style here, but a common thing is to say list style is equal to none, or list style type is equal to none. Now, this seems like it would be only a visual change, but in certain browsers, I believe in Safari and iOS, this actually removes the semantics from lists as well. So to avoid that, to make sure that the list semantics are still announced, it's important to add role list back to any list items that have their styling removed. To better explain that, you can see that the header navigation and the footer navigation have no bullets. They have no list styling applied to them. So it's possible that the normal information that would get announced, such as saying that it's a list, or when you tab between items, announcing that it's item 1 of 6, for example. Some of that information may not be conveyed unless we have role equals list. So I always like to make sure that this is added manually. One way to do this, real quick, I'm just going to open a style tag. This is not something I would do. I'm just showing what the CSS might look like. Let's say we had this navigation list class, for example, that has list style of none. Instead of doing this, what I actually might do is say, if you have a role of list, then you apply list style none. Otherwise, you would see that the bullets still appear. This is kind of a preventative measure against not having the needed role and making sure that in any case, you only remove the visual styling if you have the proper semantics and attributes in place. So that's the approach I would take in terms of these CSS. All right, probably not too many more comments on the code here, but I hope this provides a helpful example. Now, the last thing that I want to cover at this stage is on our science page, we have this accordion section here. So moving over to the science page, we're going to have overall a lot of the same recommendations with roles and hidden text and heading structures. So I'm not going to cover all of that again for this page because you would make a lot of those changes globally at once. But a lot of those should be pretty quick fixes that make quite a big impact. I'm going to go in our main tag and let's see if we can get towards the bottom here. Learn more container. That seems to be the section where our accordion is. And you can see, yeah, we have these classes for accordion. Now, accordions are actual defined patterns in terms of the required accessibility and keyboard navigation. The resource I really rely on for this is the WAI-ARIA specification. And that's this document, the WAI-ARIA authoring practices. And this basically lists out tons of design patterns and widgets. Some of these are still drafts and some of them are not fully vetted, but they're a helpful resource whenever you're creating custom component patterns for things like dialogues, accordions, list boxes, menus, etc., because they give you a baseline of the attributes you'll need as well as the semantic structure and the keyboard functionality. So if we go into accordion, for example, we should have a nice example that we can interact with. And you'll see that there are visual styling cues for keyboard focus. I'm going to use the arrow keys. You can jump between sections of an accordion. You can collapse and expand sections as needed using the space or enter keys. And once a section is expanded, then tab will allow you to move into the details of that particular section. So again, if you recall, we can't actually move keyboard focus at all to this visual accordion. So we definitely would want to follow the semantic structure outlined here by WAI-ARIA. And you'll see that it provides a helpful table of all the keys and their associated functionality. So this is important for basically creating a checklist of requirements when you're building a component like this. And you also see the necessary attributes accompanied by a very helpful markup example that often includes the CSS and JavaScript to get you started, basically. One important thing with accordions is a common convention is for the toggle or the trigger to actually be a heading with a button inside. And if we look at our accordion example here, you'll see that there's a definition list, a DL, with a term and a definition. This structure works out well for things like an FAQ, but in terms of an accordion, it kind of breaks our convention a little bit. So instead of having a DL here, and it looks like they actually have separate definition lists for each section. So this isn't even a great use of a definition list either. And it looks like they have elements that aren't really part of definition lists. So just to explain this a little bit better, definition lists can accept the following items as children. You can either have any structure of DT and DD repeated. So it's common to have multiple definitions for a single term. So if you had like apple, you could say, one definition is the fruit. Another might be, the company, for example, that might be multiple definitions and so forth. You might also have multiple terms that would be defined by the same definitions. So I can't really think of an example there. The only other structure that's allowed to be inside of DLs is a single layer of div between the DT and the DD. So you can have this structure or the bare one. You can't have any other elements. So in this case, even if this was the proper use of a definition list, which we'll cover why that isn't, you can't include things like SVG there. Instead, the SVG would need to be as part of the DT or the DD. That's kind of irrelevant to our use case because I would argue that this isn't a good use of those tags at all. If you look at the accordion, for example, we want a heading tag followed by a div for the section. And these have associated ARIA attributes and role attributes that give it the proper semantics And from there, we would want the proper keyboard support. So in our case, we'd actually just want a div. We'd want an H3 in this case with a button inside. And this would have type button with our content. This is just a very quick mock-up of what this might look like. And inside of here, we'd have a div. We grab all of our detail content there. I'd probably put that inside of a paragraph text. And from there, we would need our specific attributes on each of those elements, but you can basically see that the pattern would be quite different. And they would need to update their JavaScript for the proper interaction. So that's the changes that I would make to this section here. I'm not going to go into that in detail. In a future video, we'll look at accessibility patterns from scratch, but just know that these are things we can look out for when it comes to code review. So that's just scratching the surface of some of those changes. I hope most of these things feel feasible because in my mind, a lot of these are things that you could knock out in a single day of work. You can make a ton of improvements to this website, both in visual design and semantics, the code, the functionality, really rapidly. And those are the main steps that I would take when doing manual review of a website, which is the bulk of my review approach, especially when it comes to accessibility. Let's take a look at some automated tools and also talk about why I don't start with those and why I don't depend on them. So the first thing in Firefox available is this accessibility tab. And if you check for all issues, it'll look for contrast, keyboard, and text label issues. And you'll find that a lot of this kind of reinforces our findings with manual review. So it is helpful in that way. You can see that it shows that the color contrast is insufficient. This is only 2.2 instead of 4.5 to 1. So those would be the visual changes we talked about earlier. It'll flag things that don't have an appropriate text label. So we'd want to provide accessible names or hide those from the accessibility tree. In that case, remember our SVG tags, we said we should add ARIA hidden. So it's flagging that here. So basically automated testing like this can really reinforce a lot of the things we find in manual testing. It's a good supplement, but it's not a replacement for testing. I'd also recommend in Chromium-based browsers, here I'm in Edge, to run the Lighthouse test for accessibility. So let's go ahead and generate a report here. And this might show some conveniences, but also some flaws with automated testing. Basically, it can only test for certain things in an automated way. It can't do a lot of the manual review that we showed earlier in this video. And a lot of times it might be overly optimistic or not really provide much detail. So in this case, it flagged some contrast issues, but really didn't flag anything else. We've been talking for quite a long time in this video already, just scratching the surface of accessibility improvements to make. And here it's reporting that we have 98% compliance, or 98% in terms of the accessibility score, which I would really disagree with as an overall rating. So sometimes it can be a little bit too generous and doesn't really look for the same level of detail that we went into. So that's probably it for this episode. I hope this was a helpful overview of how to review sites for usability, accessibility, best practices in general, and the different areas that that might take, whether it's some small visual changes, code changes, functionality changes that will really take your website from something that looks great to something that functions well for everyone, all of your users. And in future episodes, we'll continue covering other popular websites. If there are specific websites you'd like to see me review or go through this process with, feel free to leave a comment with the website and why you think it would be a good candidate for this series. But I hope the main takeaway is that a lot of these changes are easy to make, they have a big impact, and you can knock quite a few out in really rapid succession if you know what you're doing and you know what you're looking for. So I encourage you to start critiquing and reviewing websites you encounter in the wild, and I hope you take this approach and apply it in your own work as well. If you enjoyed this content and would like to see more, let me know. I'm working on an accessibility course called accessible.systems. That's the URL you can check out, which will be in the description of this video. And that course will cover content, design, and development and show how to evaluate websites for accessibility in much more depth, but also how to create projects from scratch that keep accessibility top of mind and create a really great user experience for everyone. So if you'd be interested in that, feel free to check out that URL and sign up to be notified for any updates and an exclusive discount for when the course is ready. So thank you so much for watching and be sure to look out for future episodes.